Hi everyone, and welcome to my 8.1 Fury Warrior guide. This guide's going to follow much of the same format as my Legion 7.2 guide did in terms of visuals and how I display the information. I'll be going over rotations, talents, Azerite traits, and generally how Fury's looking going into the next tier. Before I get started, it's worth mentioning that this guide is based off of the already written guides out there on Icy Veins and Wowhead, so credit should go to the original author of those, who's Archie. So basically think of this more as a visual and spoken representation of the written information already out there. However, I am going to be including some stuff that has come up as a result of discussions on the Warrior Discord Skyhold. So let's begin. Fury is fundamentally a builder-spender spec, which focuses on building Rage through using its kind of core rotational abilities and then spending it all with Rampage, which is one of our hardest hitting abilities and deals most of our damage. As well as generally keeping things on cooldown like Recklessness, Siegebreaker if talented, and keeping Raging Blow off of 2 stacks and that kind of stuff, which we'll talk about a bit later. This is done by following the priority-based system. I'm going to be assuming you're running Sudden Death, Dragon's Roar, and Siegebreaker here, which are kind of the cookie-cutter talents for Uldir, and they're likely to be the most common talents used in Battle of Dazara lore, but we'll talk more about talents later. So starting with the top priority and moving all the way down to the least prioritized, we start with Rampage if above 90 Rage or not enraged, Recklessness, Siegebreaker, Execute or Sudden Death procs, Bloodthirst if Enrage is not currently active, Raging Blow at 2 charges, Bloodthirst on cooldown, Dragon's Roar when enraged, Raging Blow, and Whirlwind to fill. So let's clarify a couple of bits about this rotation. So the very first line, which is to Rampage if you're not enraged or at 90 Rage or above. That 90 Rage or above doesn't necessarily mean you have to wait until then to Rampage. What it is effectively saying is that if you're below 90 Rage and you're already enraged, you can afford one more ability before you Rage cap, making use of already being enraged effectively. And what this does is, if done perfectly over the course of an encounter, will increase your enrage uptime and give you a marginal DPS increase. Due to it only being a marginal benefit, but putting you at greater risk of overcapping Rage if you mess it up, you shouldn't feel bad about rampaging as soon as possible. It's completely acceptable to do that. That min-max of trying to gain the enrage uptime is really for people who are really comfortable with the spec and looking to just squeeze out a little bit more. Apart from that, once you get your head around the rest of the priority, it's not too difficult to execute. You basically want to be using Execute procs from Sudden Death on cooldown, Bloodthirsting if you're not enraged to try and enrage yourself. If you're already enraged, then you want to make sure you're keeping Raging Blow off of 2 stacks. If Bloodthirst is on cooldown and you're not enraged, then again make sure you keep Raging Blow off of 2 stacks. You want to be squeezing in Dragon's Roar when Bloodthirst is on cooldown and you've got 1 stack of Raging Blow, and then if you can't do anything else, you want to use Whirlwind as filler. This priority is specifically for single target, and obviously Dragon's Roar is an AoE ability. This is why it comes so far down in the priority here. Obviously, if we're AoEing or cleaving, it would come much higher up, but we'll go over that a little bit later. Additionally, you shouldn't stress too much if you can't use Dragon's Roar in the Siegebreaker window, and that's because simply you might get Sudden Death procs or Raging Blow procs, which will then trump the priority of Dragon's Roar and push it outside of Siegebreaker. But again, on single target, it's not a big deal. If you've read the Icy Veins or Wowhead guides, you might notice that those recommend using Execute from Sudden Death procs when enraged. However, I've said just to use whenever possible, and that's because when comparing sims that use Execute regardless of enraged state and sims that use Execute only when enraged, the difference is negligible. We're talking like 20 DPS. So for that reason, I'd say use it straight away in case you risk losing a proc by overwriting it with another proc of Sudden Death, which is a much bigger loss. And another reason why it really doesn't matter is because using Execute is a lot of rage gained, and that rage gained feeds into your next Rampage quicker, gets you enraged again, and really just keeps the rotation flowing nicely. Now that we've gone over the basic single target priority, let's talk about the opener a little bit. And actually, the opener isn't as simple as just charging in and then doing your priority. What you can actually do instead is Recklessness pre-pull. So 1 second before your pull timer goes off, hit Recklessness and then charge. And what that does is that actually gets you double rage from your charge, which means that if you follow up with a Siegebreaker after you actually connect to your target, you should then, if your auto attacks haven't missed, have enough rage to then rampage immediately, which means you can get straight into a big rotation. If your auto attacks do happen to miss, then you'll need to Bloodthirst, and then that will get you enough to rampage, and then you can just start pumping from there. From there on, you want to be using Siegebreaker on cooldown. If you continue to use Siegebreaker on cooldown, then it should naturally line up with your next Recklessness, at which point, again, you just want to use on cooldown, assuming that you're not going to be saving it for a big bit of burst or AoE, or save it for an encounter mechanic. That is, of course, unless you're using the Reckless Flurry trait, which is a good, strong single target trait for warriors. And what Reckless Flurry does is it reduces the cooldown left on your Recklessness, which can desync Siegebreaker and Recklessness. So it is actually a marginal gain to hold Recklessness to line it up with Siegebreaker, not the other way around. You don't want to be holding Siegebreaker. That's assuming that the fight duration means that you don't lose a cast of Recklessness due to holding it for Siegebreaker each time. Once you hit 20%, the rotation doesn't actually change. Well, actually, the rotation slightly changes, but the priority doesn't change. And what I mean by that is you're still executing when you can, and you're still rampaging when you can, and following your usual Bloodthirst and Raging Blow priority in between. However, because of the increased rage generation from execute, you're basically rampaging more often, and you should pretty much always be enraged as a result of that. When it comes to cleaving, you basically want to maintain the Whirlwind buff that is applied to you when you hit Whirlwind. What this does is it allows your next two abilities to cleave up to 5 targets, which means that you want to be using Whirlwind every third global cooldown. So you'd Whirlwind, ability, ability, Whirlwind, ability, ability. You'll be wanting to do this rotation on at least 2 targets. So as soon as there's an additional target, you'll be wanting to weave Whirlwinds into every third ability. You can also cleave Siegebreaker, the Siegebreaker debuff. So quite simply, you would Whirlwind before you Siegebreaker, and that would spread the damage taken modifier to up to 5 targets, depending on how many you hit. This is really key for getting some really good AoE off, and it's kind of why Siegebreaker has become quite a strong talent, both on single target and AoE. It's very versatile. Don't stress too much if you're rage capped and you need to Whirlwind to get your Whirlwind buff before you Rampage. Rampage is one of our hardest hitting abilities and makes up for something ridiculous like 30% of our overall damage. So you want to be making sure that is cleaved, regardless of whether you end up being rage capped for like a GCD or something. The talent that you take in the level 90 row, so either Dragon's Roar or Blade Storm, will also come way up in the priority. You'll basically want to be doing that as soon as you're enraged as one of the first abilities that you do within the Siegebreaker window. So you'll be wanting to cleave Siegebreaker, get enraged, and then use either Dragon's Roar or Blade Storm. I did mention Blade Storm earlier on the same row as Dragon's Roar, and on single target, whichever one you take, they're actually quite close on single target together, but Dragon's Roar does pull ahead slightly. They come in the same place in the priority. However, if you're in an encounter or maybe Mythic Plus where you know you're going to be getting infrequent larger groups of adds, so think Zekphos for example, then Blade Storm really starts to shine here. You can actually get some really fast big AoE bursts off in Mythic Plus using Blade Storm and Siegebreaker. What you would do is you would Recklessness pre-charge and then charge, Whirlwind to get your buff, Siegebreaker to spread the debuff, Rampage to become enraged, and then Blade Storm immediately. And that is some really big AoE damage there. And then if you're using Blade Storm during the encounter, obviously you wouldn't run out and charge. You would just, skip the charge and Recklessness, etc. Whirlwind, spread it, Rampage, get enraged, and Blade Storm. As soon as you come out of Blade Storm, you want to refresh your Whirlwind buff. And if you're lucky, you've got sudden death procs, and you can just start cleaving your Rampages and your sudden deaths, and it's all good. Speaking of talents, I'm going to go into a bit more detail here. I'm not going to go over every single talent and kind of like say what they do and stuff. The game's been out for quite a while, so you should have a vague idea of kind of what talents do. So the ones listed down the side here are the ones which have been the typical loadout for Uldir fights so far, and they'll probably be the strongest going into Battle of Dazar'alor, kind of tuning aside. That being said, some are worth going into in a little bit more detail as they have kind of some niche scenarios that they're used in. Furious Slash has actually found its place in Uldir, and that is on encounters which have a really tight enrage time, or just kind of a bit of a wonky enrage, a bit like Taluk. Due to the way his HP works, he actually has quite an extended execute phase, which means that Furious Slash gains in value. Similarly, it was used on Gahun, and the reason which makes Furious Slash strong in execute is that it gives you that haste buff, and that haste buff means more rampages, more executes, and more executes mean more rampages. It's just a feedback loop, and it just gets you really good execute damage. That being said, it's a really inversatile talent when it comes to AoE and cleave. So the niche for it is, yeah, like I say, that single target kind of execute damage. If you are taking Furious Slash, then your opener does change somewhat. So you're not going to be doing the Recklessness then charge. You're simply going to be charging, hitting Furious Slash 3 times to get that Frenzy buff stacked, and then you'll do your opener. So then you'll Recklessness, Siegebreaker. I don't think you'll have enough Rage yet to Rampage, so you might need to Bloodthirst and then Rampage, and then continue as normal. And then you'll just be wanting to refresh the Frenzy buff with Furious Slash before it runs out, or naturally through using Furious Slash as the filler as opposed to Whirlwind, whichever kind of comes first. But don't let the buff drop. It's really bad if it does. It's pretty big waste. I should give mentions to Reckless Abandon and Anger Management, that although they are subpar in a raid environment, especially Uldir, they have seen some use in Mythic Plus and can be quite fun actually. Whether it's pairing Reckless Abandon with Blazestorm, which gives you even faster AoE burst, where you can just go in there, Whirlwind, Recklessness, Rampage immediately, Bladestorm, Rampage again, or whether it's Anger Management, keeping you good uptime on Recklessness due to, you know, Pugs chain pulling and you never really kind of getting a break in between packs, giving you good uptime and keeping that CDR rolling. Meat Cleaver on the AoE row is a talent which is just a little bit too niche to see any usage outside of Zul so far, and even then, you could argue that Dragon's Roar was the superior talent for padding, effectively. So I'm not going to talk about it anymore, but I am going to talk about Inner Rage a little bit. Again, like the other talents I've mentioned, Inner Rage is just lackluster in a raid environment. It's just not quite good enough. However, it has seen usage in high fortified weeks in Mythic Plus. So we're talking, you know, like 12, 13, 14, 15s, where trash is up for a very long time, which increases the value of Inner Rage because you are constantly cleaving and AoEing with Raging Blow. And yeah, like I say, it can be really strong there. So, onto traits. 8.1 introduced some pretty tasty traits for Fury, which much like the traits in 8.0, they get their biggest benefit from the first application of the trait, and then diminished benefit for every duplicate trait stacked after that. Hopefully that makes sense. Basically, you want to try and keep one trait of each. Currently, whilst we only have 3 traits available to us, this is obviously going to change in the next tier when we get additional outer rings, which means that we're effectively going to have to stack traits at some point. When looking at single target and traits, the traits which come out on top so far are Unbridled Ferocity, Simmering Rage, Reckless Flurry, and Cold Steel Hot Blood. When we get a proc of Recklessness through Unbridled Ferocity, and we already have the Recklessness buff running, it will simply add duration onto that. And likewise, if you pop Recklessness whilst you have a proc of Unbridled Ferocity running, then it just adds the duration to that. It's a really great talent when it starts popping off, especially if you get it procking during Siegebreaker, although it can be frustrating when it just doesn't proc. It's a flat 8%, so sometimes you can have, you know, really good fights, other times you can have bad. It's a bit peaks and troughs, but it's really great because it kind of changes your gameplay as you're playing, or at least you can feel it when it procs because the haste increases and you get more rage, and it's all good stuff. Then there's Reckless Flurry that we spoke about a little bit earlier, and how that changes your cooldown reduction on Recklessness. I won't repeat myself. Then we've got Simmering Rage, which is just good rampage damage, good extra rage, and then Cold Steel Hot Blood, which does not change your, you know, your priorities. I know it goes off Bloodthirst crits, but it doesn't really fundamentally change your rotation on single target. So on AoE, you've got Simmering Rage, Unbridled Ferocity, and Cold Steel Hot Blood, all solid choices, with Reckless Flurry falling off because it's strictly a single target trait. It has no benefit on AoE because it's based on auto attacks. And also, if you're running Bladestorm, then Gathering Storm can be quite valuable on AoE. Once the Battle of Dazara Law raid opens, we're going to get the access to an additional ring on all our Azerite pieces, which basically means we will then be stacking Azerite traits. So you know I said earlier that the Fury traits work best when they get their first application, and then from there on stacking them as diminished returns. That still stays true, but we now have more rings, so trait stacking becomes, you know, a bit more of a valid thing. Not really sure yet what traits are going to be the best ones to stack. Cold Steel Hot Blood's probably going to be quite good. Again, with Simmering Rage, possibly Pulverizing Blows, we're really unsure, so you just have to wait and see for sims. Speaking about gearing and simming and that kind of thing, let's talk about stat weights. Okay, all done. No, but in all seriousness, I'm not actually going to go into any details on stat weights. They can be very misleading and generally not really worth going into much detail. Just as Fury, you'll be aiming for generally haste mastery gear. Use raid bots to sim yourself and use the top gear function to kind of do all the hard work and the legwork and to determine what your best set of gear is going to be. You can honestly just chuck all your gear into it, run a top gear, it will tell you everything, work out your stat weights, and you don't need to worry about it. And that just about rounds it up. Although it's really hard to tell which spec is going to come out on top in the next tier, Fury's had some very favourable traits added. That in conjunction with the fact that ARMS has had their Execute Rage Refund nerfed, they've had their double dipping Rage Refund on Sweeping Strikes fixed, as well as EP being removed. Fury's looking very favourable at the moment, so I can keep my fingers crossed and hope that we once again become the meta spec in the next tier. Hopefully this video's been useful and you picked something up from it, or it's at least given you something to think about. Like I said at the start of the video, credit goes to the guides written on Icy Veins and Wowhead. They're fantastic resources if you want to go check them out. Also, thank you to those who have had daily discussions in the Skyhold Discord, the Warrior Discord. Without those kind of discussions, I wouldn't be able to add such good detail to this video. Once the new raid is out, I will be doing my Fury Warrior commentary videos on those. That's basically where I go over the fights from a progression standpoint, kind of talk about my talent selection, trait selection, and how I approach the fight. I've done it for the last 2 tiers, and I'm going to continue doing it. You can also follow my stream on Twitch/Coburn_25 for raiding on EU times. Other than that, thank you for watching, and I will see you next time. Cheers.